Welcome, dear listeners, to another tale from the Drawing Room Detectives. Tonight, we venture into the shadowy corners of Victorian England, where science and superstition collide in the most unexpected ways. In the singular affair of the two-headed calf, nothing is as it seems, not the law, not nature, and certainly not the motives of men. So settle in, keep your wits about you, and let us unravel this most peculiar case together. Chapter 1. A Most Singular Corpse. It was on a grey morning in early November that I found Sherlock Holmes seated cross-legged upon the hearthrug, his pipe clenched between his teeth, and a scattered pile of monographs and legal compendiums strewn around him like the detritus of some scholarly storm. He had risen before dawn, it seemed, and had taken to poring over obscure points of law with an intensity that would have done credit to a barrister in the midst of a murder trial. For my part, I had been content with the newspaper and a modest breakfast, and was halfway through the leading article when Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. She placed it upon the mantelpiece without comment, but Holmes's eyes, keen and restless, had already fastened upon it. "Another petition from Scotland Yard, no doubt," I remarked. Holmes shook his head with a smile that bordered on the sardonic. "Too early for the Yard, Watson. Their industry seldom stirs before 10. No, this has the ring of the provinces about it. Observe the quality of the paper and the economy of words. May I?" I nodded, and he tore open the envelope with one swift motion. As he read, his brows lifted, and a glint of something dangerously close to excitement appeared in his gaze. "Well?" I prompted, setting aside the newspaper. He passed the telegram to me without a word. It read, "Most peculiar death at Blackwood Hall, Sussex. Squire found dead in barn beside two-headed calf, both stabbed identically. Local authorities baffled. Request your immediate assistance. Signed, Phelps." "Phelps?" I said, recalling Sergeant Arthur Phelps, once my comrade in Afghanistan. "Indeed. Your military acquaintances continue to provide me with curious diversions," Holmes replied with a dry chuckle. "A squire and a two-headed calf, Watson. Even for me that presents a novel juxtaposition." I could not help but smile at his tone, though the gravity of the telegram was plain enough. Holmes had already risen to his feet and was reaching for his coat. "My dear fellow, I would cross half of England for the chance to examine such a singular corpse. Pack a bag for 2 nights and be sure to bring your medical instruments. I suspect you will be called upon before the day is out." An hour later we were aboard the train to Sussex, our carriage rattling southward beneath leaden skies. Holmes sat opposite me, silent and introspective, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. I knew better than to interrupt him when he fell into these moods, for experience had taught me that his mind was already constructing possibilities, weaving patterns from the barest threads of information. As the train left the soot-streaked suburbs of London behind, I found my thoughts returning to Phelps, a sturdier fellow I had seldom known, with a blunt sense of humour and a steadfast devotion to duty. If he described the matter as most peculiar, then I could only assume the case possessed features of truly unusual character. We arrived at the village station just after noon, where Phelps awaited us on the platform. Time had thickened his waist and streaked his moustache with grey, but the grip of his hand was as firm as I remembered. "Dr. Watson, and Mr. Holmes, sir. Never thought I'd see the day I'd be wiring you for help, but this one's beyond all reckoning." Holmes inclined his head. "You will find, Sergeant, that it is often the very impossibility of a thing that makes it worthy of investigation." Phelps led us to a waiting dog-cart, and as we drove through narrow lanes flanked by bare hedgerows, he recounted the grim details. "Sir Eustace Blackwood, squire of these parts, was found dead 2 nights ago. His body lay in the barn, next to a two-headed calf he'd bought from a travelling show. Both stabbed, sir. Same spot, same depth. The village doctor says the blade went clean through heart and lung. And the weapon? Holmes asked. Phelps shook his head. No sign of it, nor of any footprints save the squire's own. The barn doors were bolted from within. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A locked room problem as well. Truly, Sussex has outdone itself. There's more, Phelps added grimly. The will, sir. There's talk of something strange in the inheritance. Folk in the village say Sir Eustace stood to lose everything if he didn't. But I'll let the solicitor explain. I thought it best to leave the details for your ear alone. Holmes nodded approvingly. You exercised good judgment, Sergeant. Lead us to the scene. Blackwood Hall came into view as we crested a low hill, its gabled roof and ivy-clad walls standing solemn against the bleak November sky. Beyond the house the barn squatted like a dark sentinel, its doors firmly shut, a constable stationed at the entrance. As we approached, I could see Holmes's stride quicken, his grey eyes already darting from door latch to muddy ground, from window ledge to roof line. The game, he murmured, almost to himself, is most assuredly afoot. With that, we crossed the threshold into one of the strangest crime scenes I had ever beheld. Chapter 2. The Sussex Mystery. The interior of the barn was dim and cold, the late afternoon light slanting weakly through the high windows and casting long bars of shadow upon the earthen floor. A faint, lingering odour of hay mingled with something far less pleasant, a coppery tang that needed no introduction to one with medical training. Holmes paused just within the doorway, his keen gaze sweeping the length and breadth of the building. The scene, though plainly disturbed by the earlier investigations, retained enough of its original condition for a trained observer to draw conclusions. In the centre of the barn lay the body of Sir Eustace Blackwood. The squire's frame was heavy-set, the broad shoulders and ruddy complexion speaking of a man accustomed to outdoor pursuits. His tweed coat lay askew, and his shirt had been torn open to reveal the fatal wound over the heart. The fabric surrounding the puncture was stiff with dried blood. Beside him, displayed with grim theatricality, lay the carcass of the two-headed calf. The animal, preserved by what I presumed to be taxidermy, rested on its side, its grotesque second head protruding awkwardly from the neck, its glass eyes staring blankly into the gloom. A dark stain on its flank matched the location of the wound on the squire's chest. Holmes approached the bodies with that peculiar cat-like tread I had seen countless times before, light yet deliberate, as though unwilling to disturb the air itself. He knelt first by Sir Eustace, inspecting the wound with clinical detachment. "Clean and direct," he murmured. A single thrust, delivered with force and anatomical knowledge. The trajectory suggests the assailant stood directly before him, at close range. I crouched beside him, observing the wound with professional interest. A blade of considerable length, I added, perhaps a dagger or long knife. The angle suggests the victim was standing upright when struck. Holmes nodded, already shifting his attention to the calf. His hands moved with swift precision, examining the stitched seams along the animal's flanks, the mounting wires within, and the artificial rigidity of its limbs. "A recent acquisition, I believe," he said at length. "The preservation is fresh, the dust upon it minimal. Tell me, Sergeant," he called over his shoulder, "when was this unfortunate creature brought here?" Phelps, who had been watching us from the door, stepped forward. "Only a week ago, sir. Came from a travelling show passing through Lewes. Sir Eustace had it delivered here for reasons unknown to us." Holmes rose, dusting his hands. "Reasons which shall soon become clearer, I trust." He turned his attention next to the floor, examining the scuffed straw and dirt with the aid of his lens. After a few minutes of silent study, he moved to the barn doors and carefully inspected the bolts and hinges. "There is only one entrance?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Phelps replied. "Doors were locked from the inside when we found him. Windows too small for any man to pass." Holmes tapped his fingers thoughtfully against his coat sleeve. "And the discovery?" "The housekeeper raised the alarm when Sir Eustace failed to appear for breakfast. When we forced the doors, we found him as you see." "Any sign of struggle elsewhere?" "Footprints, disturbed soil, broken branches leading away from the barn." "None, sir. That's what has us confounded." Holmes allowed himself a brief smile. "A locked room problem, a surgically precise killing, and a symbolic tableau involving a two-headed calf. Truly, Sussex offers us a rich puzzle." As we left the barn and crossed the yard toward the main house, Holmes's pace slowed. He stooped suddenly to pluck something from the gravel path. Holding it between thumb and forefinger, he inspected the object with quiet satisfaction. "A fragment of yellow wax," he said, tucking it into his pocket. "Not remarkable in itself, but curious when found here." We entered the great hall of Blackwood Hall, where the air was heavy with the scent of polished oak and lingering tobacco. The late squire's solicitor, a thin and fidgeting man named Mr. Hargrave, awaited us in the drawing-room. His hands trembled slightly as he gestured for us to sit. "I understand you wish to speak with me regarding the estate," Holmes said. "Indeed," Mr. Hargrave replied. "Sir Eustace's will contains certain unusual provisions which I fear may bear directly upon this dreadful business." Holmes leaned forward, his grey eyes alight with interest. "Pray proceed." And with that, the tangled skein of the Blackwood legacy began to unravel before us. Chapter 3. The Blackwood Legacy. Mr. Hargrave, the solicitor, cleared his throat with a nervous rasp and reached for a leather folder resting on the table beside him. His hands, I noticed, were thin and bird-like, the fingers stained faintly with ink. "The late Sir Eustace Blackwood," he began, glancing uneasily toward the door as though expecting some unseen auditor, "was not perhaps a man widely known for his eccentricities, at least not until recent months." Holmes settled deeper into his chair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You intrigue me, Mr. Hargrave. Please, continue." The solicitor opened the folder and withdrew a sheaf of neatly folded documents. "This is a certified copy of the will, executed some 5 years ago and amended only last March." Holmes took the papers and began to scan them rapidly, his sharp eyes moving with remarkable speed from line to line. I watched as his brows lifted slightly, a sure sign that something of interest had presented itself. "It would appear," Holmes remarked after a pause, "that Sir Eustace's estate was to pass, in the absence of direct heirs, to his cousin, Dr. Ignatius Vane." "Correct," said Mr. Hargrave with a nervous nod. "Dr. Vane, a biologist by trade, residing near Lewes." Holmes's lips curled in a faint, unreadable smile. "A man with scientific leanings. How very interesting. There is, however," Hargrave continued, "a condition attached to that inheritance, an extraordinary one, I must confess, and one that Sir Eustace insisted upon personally." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Pray, do elaborate." Mr. Hargrave leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The will stipulates that in order for Dr. Vane to inherit the estate, Sir Eustace must, within his lifetime, succeed in breeding and publicly exhibiting a most rare and singular creature." These were the squire's exact words. Holmes's smile deepened. A curious phrase. Was there any clarification as to what constituted such a creature? "None," Hargrave replied, shaking his head. Sir Eustace seemed content to leave the interpretation to himself. However, it is my understanding that he had developed something of an obsession with biological oddities in recent years. He travelled extensively to agricultural fairs and even corresponded with certain members of the Royal Agricultural Society. Watson, who had been listening in thoughtful silence, now spoke. Such clauses are unusual but not unheard of. There are precedents for eccentric wills, especially among rural landowners. Quite so, Holmes agreed. Still, it strikes me that the recent acquisition of a two-headed calf may well have been intended to satisfy this peculiar condition. Precisely my thought, Mr. Holmes, said Hargrave with some relief. The calf arrived just days before the squire's death. Sir Eustace had planned to display it at the local fairgrounds within the fortnight. Holmes tapped the papers against the arm of his chair. And now, with the squire dead, the estate hangs in abeyance. Until the validity of this singular creature can be confirmed, the question of inheritance remains unsettled. Hargrave inclined his head. The executors are unwilling to proceed until the matter is clarified. Holmes rose suddenly, moving to the window where he stood with hands clasped behind his back, staring out over the mist-draped fields. "Tell me, Mr. Hargrave," he said at length without turning, "what can you tell me of Dr. Vane's character?" The solicitor hesitated. "I would prefer, sir, not to speak ill of a man I know only through reputation, but there are those in the village who find him unsettling. His experiments with livestock have raised eyebrows, to say the least." Holmes turned then, his expression thoughtful. "I shall wish to speak with Dr. Vane at the earliest opportunity." A knock at the door interrupted us, and Phelps entered with a grave expression. "Beg pardon, sir," he said to Holmes, "but we've found something behind the barn, buried shallow just beneath the hedgerow." Holmes's eyes sharpened at once. "Indeed? And what is it?" Phelps lowered his voice. "A sack, sir. Inside it another calf, deceased, this one with a single head but showing signs of surgical tampering." Holmes's gaze darkened with interest. "The plot thickens, Watson," he said quietly. "It would appear that our late squire's legacy is more complicated than it first appeared." With that, Holmes reached for his hat and coat. "Come, gentlemen," he said. "I believe a visit to Dr. Ignatius Vane is now most urgently required." Chapter 4. The Freak Show Connection. 2 days after our arrival in Sussex, Holmes announced that he wished to visit Lewes, where a travelling exhibition of curiosities had recently set up along the town green. Phelps secured us a trap, and by late morning we were on our way, the countryside rolling past in a haze of cold autumn mist. "The connection is too plain to ignore," Holmes remarked as we rode. "Sir Eustace acquires a two-headed calf from this show mere days before his death. I must see the source for myself." We found the exhibition spread across a muddy field at the edge of town. Canvas tents flapped noisily in the wind, their painted banners boasting of bearded ladies, sword-swallowers, and all manner of grotesque attractions. The air carried the mingled scents of sawdust, oil lamps, and livestock. Holmes paid the entrance fee with a distracted air and led us directly to the far corner where a faded sign announced "Marvels of Nature, Freaks and Rarities." Inside, the space was dim and close. A stuffed, two-headed lamb stood on a pedestal, its glass eyes dulled by years of dust. Nearby, a calf with an extra limb protruding from its shoulder lay within a cracked display case. A handful of spectators drifted among the exhibits, whispering in low voices. Holmes approached the proprietor, a stout man with ruddy cheeks and thinning hair, who stood behind a worn counter polishing spectacles. "Mr. Crail, I presume?" Holmes said. The man looked up with mild surprise. "That's me, sir. What can I do for you?" Holmes produced a calling card with a flourish. "Sherlock Holmes. I have come regarding the two-headed calf recently sold to Sir Eustace Blackwood." Recognition dawned on Crail's face. "Ah, yes, poor gentleman. Heard about his passing, I did. Dreadful business." Could you tell me when the transaction occurred? Little over a fortnight ago, Crail replied. Sir Eustace came by, took quite an interest in the specimen, paid a good price too, had it sent to his estate that same week. Holmes nodded. And before Sir Eustace, did anyone else inquire about that particular calf? Crail scratched his head. Now that you mention it, yes. A few days prior, another gentleman came poking around, tall, thin sort, with a pointed beard and sharp features. Spoke with a northern accent, if I recall right. Asked whether I had any two-headed livestock for sale. I glanced at Holmes, then stepped forward. Did he wear spectacles? Gold-rimmed, perhaps? Crail's eyes widened. That's him, sir. Wore a grey coat and carried a leather satchel. Had the look of a doctor about him. Holmes turned to me with a brief, satisfied glance. You recognize the description, Watson? I nodded grimly. Holmes pressed further. Did this man leave any name or contact information? None, said Crail. But he seemed disappointed when I told him the calf was already promised to Sir Eustace. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And did he inquire about any other specimens? He did, sir. Asked if I had others like it or knew where more could be found. Holmes stood silent for a moment, then withdrew a coin and placed it on the counter. You have been most helpful, Mr. Crail. Should the gentleman return, kindly send word to Blackwood Hall at once. As we stepped back into the cold afternoon light, Holmes drew his coat tighter around him. Vane is circling the heart of this case like a hungry wolf, he said. Come, Watson, our next step takes us to his lair. Chapter 5. The Biologist's Laboratory. Late that evening, beneath a sky heavy with low clouds, Holmes and I set out for Dr. Ignatius Vane's residence, a solitary house that stood on the outskirts of Lewes. The building, a narrow and brooding structure of brick and timber, bore all the signs of neglect. Its windows remained dark, save for a faint glow visible behind a curtain on the upper floor. Holmes had timed our arrival carefully. From the inquiries he made earlier in the day, we knew that Dr. Vane conducted his research at odd hours, and that tonight he was expected to deliver a lecture at a nearby naturalist society. With luck, we would have an hour's grace. We approached from the rear garden, keeping low among the hedges. Holmes, ever the master of silent movement, slipped a slender tool from his pocket and worked at the back door with practised ease. Within moments, the lock yielded, and we stepped into the house. The air inside was stale, thick with the mingled scents of formaldehyde, dried herbs, and animal musk. Holmes produced a small lantern from within his coat and lit it, the soft glow illuminating a narrow corridor lined with bookshelves. "Remain close, Watson," he whispered. We made our way upstairs and paused before a door at the end of the hall. A hastily scrawled placard read, "Private Laboratory." Holmes turned the handle gently. The door creaked, but it opened without resistance. The room beyond was cluttered to excess. Jars containing malformed fetuses sat on dusty shelves, their pale contents floating in yellowing spirits. Diagrams of animal anatomy, some marked with red ink and annotated in Latin, were tacked to the walls. Along one workbench, rows of surgical instruments lay neatly arranged beside coils of wire and surgical thread. Watson, his face grim, surveyed the scene with growing distaste. "This is no ordinary naturalist's workshop," he said quietly. Holmes moved quickly, scanning a series of notebooks scattered across a desk. With rapid fingers, he flipped through pages filled with dense handwriting and anatomical sketches. "Listen to this," he murmured, holding one volume open for my view. "Intentional induction of polycephaly in bovine subjects. Early results inconclusive. Surgical modification to be considered as secondary method." I frowned. "Polycephaly? Two-headed development, Watson, either by natural mutation or, as these notes suggest, by artificial means. Holmes closed the book with a snap. Our friend Vane has been busy indeed. Holmes then moved to a covered cage in the corner. Lifting the drape carefully, he revealed a small, sickly calf with misshapen limbs, its breathing laboured and eyes dulled by suffering. "Dear heavens," I whispered. Before we could investigate further, the sound of footsteps echoed from below. Holmes extinguished the lantern at once and pulled me behind a tall cabinet just as a figure entered the room. It was a large, stoop-shouldered man in a stained coat, likely Vane's assistant. He moved heavily, muttering to himself as he crossed to the workbench and began rearranging bottles and papers. I felt Holmes's hand on my arm, steady and firm, signalling for absolute silence. The minutes stretched, each one longer than the last, as the man lingered near our hiding place. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and insistent, in my ears. At last, the assistant yawned audibly, took up a cloth sack, and left the room. We waited until his steps faded down the hall before Holmes nudged me toward the door. We slipped out the way we had come, careful to leave no trace. Once safely beyond the garden gate, Holmes exhaled softly, his expression a mixture of triumph and grim determination. "There can be little doubt now," he said, as we made our way back to Blackwood Hall. "Dr. Vane is breeding deformities for a single, sinister purpose. The inheritance clause has become both motive and blueprint for murder." Chapter 6. The Agricultural Society's Records. 2 days after our nocturnal visit to Dr. Vane's place, Holmes declared that the time had come to pursue the paper trail of our elusive suspect. Accordingly, we took the early train to London and made our way to the headquarters of the Royal Agricultural Society in Westminster. The building, a fine example of late Victorian institutional architecture, stood behind a wrought-iron fence on a quiet street. Its tall windows overlooked a modest garden, now withered by the season's chill. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper, varnish, and the faint trace of pipe tobacco. Holmes approached the front desk, where a clerk sat hunched over a ledger, spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose. "I seek information," Holmes began, producing a card with a practised flick of his wrist on certain applications submitted by a Dr. Ignatius Vane of Sussex, matters concerning livestock classification. The clerk, a lean young man with ink-stained cuffs, examined the card with growing interest. "Dr. Vane, sir. I remember the name. Caused quite a stir here, he did." Holmes's eyes brightened. "Indeed. Might I trouble you for the particulars?" The clerk disappeared into a side room, leaving us momentarily alone amid the shelves of bound volumes and glass cases filled with agricultural trophies. Holmes moved restlessly from one display to another, his gaze sharp and impatient. "I had suspected," he said to me in a low tone, "that our friend Vane's ambitions extended beyond mere inheritance. The desire for recognition, especially from a professional body such as this, can drive men to dangerous extremes." The clerk returned, holding a stack of correspondence and forms. "Dr. Vane submitted 3 applications over the past 2 years, he explained. Each concerned so-called novel breeds of livestock, 2-headed calves, conjoined lambs, and the like. He claimed to have developed them through selective breeding." Holmes examined the papers with swift, practised movements. "And what was the Society's response?" "Rejection, sir," the clerk said with a wry smile. "Every time, our committee ruled his claims unsubstantiated and his specimens unnatural. There were accusations of surgical tampering, though nothing proven. Dr. Vane was most displeased." Holmes handed the papers back with a nod of thanks. "May I ask, was Sir Eustace Blackwood ever in correspondence with the Society regarding these matters?" The clerk considered this. "Yes, as a matter of fact. Sir Eustace made inquiries not long before his death. He requested records of Dr. Vane's submissions, expressing concern about certain dealings between them. Holmes's expression darkened. "I see. And did he visit the society in person?" "Once, sir, about a month ago." Holmes thanked the man and turned to me as we exited the building. "Vane's rejection by the society must have been a bitter blow," he said. With his academic reputation tarnished, the inheritance offered a lifeline. But Sir Eustace, it seems, had begun to suspect the nature of Vane's manipulations. I followed Holmes as he strode down the steps into the street. "You believe Sir Eustace confronted him?" I asked. "I believe," Holmes replied grimly, "that Sir Eustace discovered the fraud and threatened to expose it, and for that he was silenced. The staged scene in the barn was meant to satisfy the inheritance clause and erase the witness at one stroke." He paused at the corner, glancing up at the heavy London sky. "We are closing in, Watson, but there remains the matter of proof, and for that I believe the taxidermist will provide our next clue." Chapter 7. The Taxidermist's Testimony. The following morning found us in the cluttered back room of a small taxidermy shop near Charing Cross. The air was thick with the scent of varnish, drying agents, and old straw. Shelves lined the walls, filled with glass-eyed birds and small game in lifelike poses. A half-mounted fox stood on a workbench, frozen mid-snarl. Mr. Josiah Trent, the proprietor, was a wiry man with spectacles perched low on his nose and fingers stained with glue and dye. When Holmes presented his card and inquired about the two-headed calf prepared for Sir Eustace Blackwood, the taxidermist's face darkened with recognition. "I remember it well, sir," he said, setting aside a jar of preserving fluid. "Unusual commission, brought in 3 weeks ago by a manservant from Blackwood Hall. Gave strict instructions for a rush job." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "I would like to know everything about the condition of the specimen when it arrived." Mr. Trent removed his spectacles and polished them on his sleeve. "To begin with, sir, the calf was already dead when it came to me. No question of that. It had been that way at least 2 days by my reckoning. The skin was starting to turn." Holmes nodded. "And the wounds?" At this, Mr. Trent hesitated. "That is where the matter becomes strange. While working on the mount, I noted 2 puncture wounds on the body. Clean, deep, just over the left side of the chest." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Matching the injuries later found on Sir Eustace?" "Exactly so, sir. But here is the curious part. There was no bleeding, none at all. The tissue around the wounds showed no signs of trauma. The stab marks were made after death. I would stake my reputation on it." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. I understood at once the significance of this revelation. "Post-mortem wounds," Holmes said softly. "Staged for effect." Mr. Trent nodded. "That was my conclusion as well, sir, though I said nothing at the time. A tradesman learns to ask few questions." Holmes straightened, his expression sharpening with renewed purpose. "One last thing, Mr. Trent. Did you observe anything peculiar in the coloration of the animal's gums or tongue? Any unnatural discoloration?" The taxidermist scratched his head. "Now that you mention it, yes. The tongue had a darkened, almost bluish cast. I took it for simple decay, given the state of the carcass." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, you are thinking what I am thinking." I nodded. "Cyanosis, a classic indicator of asphyxia or certain poisons." Holmes's face hardened. "Indeed. And given what we know of Dr. Vane's background, I would wager we are dealing with the latter." My thoughts drifted back to a case from my early medical days when a local farmer had died suddenly after ingesting a toxic alkaloid found in monk's hood. The symptoms had been swift and fatal, with little external evidence to betray the true cause. Holmes retrieved his hat and offered the taxidermist a brief, courteous bow. "You have been of invaluable service, Mr. Trent. I shall make certain the appropriate authorities are informed that your part in this business was entirely professional." As we stepped back onto the busy street, Holmes's voice took on a determined tone. "Now, Watson, we know the truth of the calf's death. The question remains, can we prove the same method was used on Sir Eustace? It is time we paid Dr. Vane a second visit, and this time we shall not leave empty-handed." Chapter 8. The Darwinian Defence. By the time we returned to Sussex, Holmes had carefully prepared both evidence and strategy. With the support of Sergeant Phelps and a warrant secured from the local magistrate, we made our way to Dr. Vane's residence late the following afternoon. The house stood as silent and brooding as before, but this time Holmes did not approach it as a trespasser. The front door was answered by Vane himself, his expression one of thinly veiled annoyance. "I must insist that this intrusion cease," Vane said coldly as we entered the dim hall. "I have important research to conduct." "Your research can wait," Holmes replied. "Dr. Vane, you are under investigation for the murder of Sir Eustace Blackwood. I advise you to answer my questions carefully." Vane laughed softly, the sound bitter and hollow. "Murder? Nonsense! The man's death was unfortunate, yes, but hardly my doing." Holmes gestured for Phelps to stand near the door, barring any escape. "You were seen inquiring about two-headed livestock," Holmes continued. "Your applications to the Royal Agricultural Society were rejected. Your laboratory contains evidence of surgical tampering, and now we know the calf was stabbed post-mortem to stage a scene that would satisfy the conditions of the Blackwood inheritance." Vane's eyes narrowed. "And even if all that were true, where is the crime? Nature is a brutal, unfeeling mechanism. Evolution demands adaptation and struggle. I was merely applying its principles. Darwin himself said that survival favors the strongest and the most resourceful." Holmes's voice remained cool. "Darwin did not recommend murder for financial gain." Vane's temper flared. "You speak as though I acted from base greed. It was not about money. It was about proving that life, even at its most grotesque, can be manipulated, directed, improved." Holmes stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "You speak of improvement, yet your experiments were crude forgeries. Your so-called breeding program was a farce, propped up by deception and a willingness to poison a man who stood in your way." I saw a flicker of something in Vane's expression, a crack in the mask of superiority he wore so carefully. "Sir Eustace suspected you," Holmes pressed on. "He contacted the Agricultural Society, sought records, asked questions, and when you learned that your scheme was close to exposure, you acted with finality." Vane's hands clenched at his sides. "You have no proof." "We have the taxidermist statement, the forged breeding records, and soon, I expect, chemical analysis of the squire's remains will confirm poisoning." For one brief second, Vane stood motionless. Then, with sudden speed, he lunged past us, knocking over a lamp and plunging the room into shadow. Before we could recover, he was out the door and across the garden. "After him, Watson!" Holmes shouted. We gave chase across the fields, stumbling over furrows and brambles. Vane reached the main road and commandeered a passing cart, forcing the driver to leap clear as he snapped the reins and tore off toward Lewes Station. Holmes and I secured a trap from a nearby farm and followed at speed, arriving at the station just in time to see Vane boarding the London train. We followed without hesitation. Once in London, the chase continued through winding streets and narrow alleys, past warehouses and across rain-slick cobblestones. Holmes, always tireless in pursuit, tracked our quarry toward the docks at Wapping. By the time we reached the wharf, night had fallen. Fog drifted low over the Thames, mingling with the smoke from moored steamers. Vane darted among crates and barrels, but Holmes was close behind. Near the end of a deserted quay, Vane slipped on the wet boards and fell heavily. Before he could rise, Holmes was upon him, pinning him with surprising strength. "It is over, Dr. Vane," Holmes said, breathing hard but triumphant. "Science may excuse many things, but not murder." With Phelps's assistance, Vane was hauled to his feet, his fine coat torn and his spectacles lost somewhere in the mud. Holmes straightened, brushing dirt from his sleeves. "Come, Watson," he said quietly. "Let us deliver our man to Scotland Yard. There remains a great deal yet to be explained, but at least now the killing is done." Chapter 9. The Freak Show Finale. Despite his capture at the docks, Dr. Ignatius Vane's cunning had not yet run its course. During his temporary holding at the local police station, he managed, by means still not entirely clear to us, to escape custody 2 nights later. The news reached Baker Street shortly after breakfast, delivered by a breathless constable from Scotland Yard. Holmes received the report with grim satisfaction. "As I feared," he said, tossing aside the note. "A man with Vane's resourcefulness would not remain confined for long. However, his options for hiding are limited. He is without funds and without friends." I looked up from my chair. "Where would a man like him run to?" Holmes rose, reaching for his coat. "To the only place where a disfigured or desperate man may blend in without drawing notice, among others who trade in the grotesque." Within the hour, we were once again bound for Lewes, this time heading straight to the travelling show we had visited days earlier. The exhibition remained camped on the town green, its faded banners still promising wonders and horrors to the paying public. Holmes pushed past the line of spectators and approached Mr. Crail, the proprietor, who stood near the entrance smoking a foul cigar. "Mr. Crail," Holmes said in low tones, "has there been any new addition to your troupe within the last 48 hours? Crail frowned. "Funny you should ask, sir. A fellow turned up yesterday. Said he was a performance artist from the continent. Offered to work for board and food. Odd sort, pale as paper, with a trembling in his hands. Said he wanted to perform as a mad scientist." Holmes's eyes lit at once. "Where is he now?" Crail gestured toward a tent at the far end of the grounds. "We set him up in the new exhibit, sir, charging 2d for the public to hear his rants about evolution and progress." Without another word, Holmes strode toward the tent, motioning for me to follow. We slipped behind a group of curious onlookers gathered near the entrance. Inside, the scene was bizarre in the extreme. Beneath a string of flickering gas lamps stood a figure in a long, tattered laboratory coat. His face was streaked with dirt, and his dark hair hung loose about his face. He stood behind a table, cluttered with bottles and glass tubes, addressing the crowd with wild gestures and fevered rhetoric about human advancement and the future of science. I recognized him at once. Even beneath the grime and theatrics, Vane's thin, sharp features remained unmistakable. Holmes wasted no time. Moving through the crowd, he stepped onto the platform and placed a firm hand on the fugitive's shoulder. "Your performance," Holmes said quietly, "is at an end, Dr. Vane." For a moment Vane froze, as though uncertain whether to flee or fight. Then, with a snarl of frustration, he overturned the table, sending glassware shattering across the floor. Spectators shrieked and scattered as the scene dissolved into chaos. Vane darted toward the rear exit, but Holmes was ready. With a sudden burst of speed, he seized the man by the collar and dragged him to the ground. Together with the help of 2 constables who had followed us from the station, Holmes secured Vane in irons. The show's patrons, recovering from their fright, now stood watching the arrest with morbid curiosity, some even applauding as if it were part of the entertainment. Holmes pulled Vane to his feet and spoke loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "the performance is concluded. This man is wanted for the murder of Sir Eustace Blackwood and the attempted fraud of a landed estate." With that, Holmes turned to me, his expression one of weary satisfaction. "Come, Watson," he said, "let us leave this carnival of false wonders. The true work now begins in the courts." Chapter 10. The Legal Singularity. The trial of Dr. Ignatius Vane commenced on a dreary London morning, the courtroom thick with the murmurs of spectators eager to witness the resolution of what the papers had already dubbed the two-headed calf affair. Sherlock Holmes, ever composed, sat beside me with an air of quiet satisfaction, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he observed the proceedings with keen, half-lidded eyes. The prosecution laid out the case methodically, detailing Vane's obsession with Darwinian theory and his perverse application of it through surgical monstrosities. Yet it was Holmes's testimony that proved most damning. With the precision of a scholar, he cited Blackstone's commentaries and an obscure 14th-century statute known as De Monstris Hereditatis, which tied land inheritance to the exhibition of biological anomalies. The law, Holmes declared, his voice cutting through the hushed courtroom, was intended to reward the display of natural wonders, not the manufacture of them. Sir Eustace Blackwood's estate cannot pass under fraudulent pretences. Vane, his once arrogant demeanour frayed at the edges, attempted to argue that his work was scientific innovation. "Nature herself produces aberrations," he insisted, his eyes feverish. "I merely hastened her hand." Holmes, with a disdainful flick of his fingers, produced a sheaf of papers from his pocket. "These are your laboratory notes, Doctor, which detail not scientific inquiry, but deliberate deception. You poisoned Sir Eustace when he uncovered your scheme, then staged the scene with the mutilated calf to invoke the inheritance clause. This was not science. It was murder for profit." The judge, an old man with a face like weathered parchment, peered down at Vane over his spectacles. "The court finds your actions a grotesque perversion of both law and natural philosophy." With that, the verdict was sealed. Vane was sentenced to hang, his name struck from all reputable scientific circles. The Blackwood estate, freed from the taint of his machinations, passed to a distant cousin, a young man of respectable character who had no interest in two-headed livestock. As we left the Old Bailey, the drizzle clinging to our coats, I found myself reflecting on the strange intersection of medieval superstition and modern science that had defined the case. "It's remarkable," I mused, "how an ancient law could be twisted so vilely in an age of progress." Holmes gave one of his rare, dry smiles. "The more things change, Watson, the more human nature remains the same. Greed and ingenuity have ever been bedfellows." We hailed a cab, and as we rattled back toward Baker Street, I could not help but marvel at the depths of Holmes's knowledge, how his mind could leap from the intricacies of heredity to the dusty corners of forgotten jurisprudence with equal ease. "You've done justice today, Holmes," I said. He waved a hand dismissively. "Justice was already written, my dear fellow. I merely turned the page." And with that, he lapsed into silence, his gaze fixed on the fog beyond the window, no doubt already turning over some new puzzle in that remarkable brain of his. Chapter 11. The Two-Headed Calf's Secret. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows as Inspector Lestrade shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his notebook open but forgotten on his knee. Holmes stood before the mantelpiece, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, the very picture of satisfaction. I had just poured our tea when Holmes began his explanation. "The key to the entire affair," Holmes said, his eyes gleaming with that peculiar intensity which accompanied his revelations, "lay not in the existence of the two-headed calf, but in its perfection. Nature, my dear Lestrade, is rarely so symmetrical in her abnormalities. I set down the teapot with a clink. You mean to say the creature was not a true freak of birth? Precisely, Watson. Observe these photographs taken at the Agricultural Society's exhibition last year. Holmes produced a series of lantern slides from his desk drawer, laying them out with meticulous care. Note the stitching at the base of the second skull, nearly invisible to the untrained eye, yet unmistakable under magnification. The skin graft where the neck's joined shows telltale signs of surgical thread. Lestrade leaned forward, squinting at the images. Do you mean to tell me Dr. Vane stitched two calves together? But why go to such monstrous lengths? Holmes retrieved a leather-bound journal from his collection of evidence, opening it to a marked page. Sir Eustace's will specified inheritance required exhibiting a most rare and singular creature. Vane, knowing the squire's fascination with biological oddities, created the perfect lure. The calf was never alive in this state, Lestrade. It was assembled from two stillborn specimens, preserved through Vane's considerable taxidermic skill. I felt a chill run down my spine as the full horror of the scheme became clear. Then the identical stab wounds were theatrical additions, Holmes finished, meant to invoke the medieval statute while disguising the true cause of death, which was, as we now know, a simple but effective poisoning. The squire discovered the fraud, confronted Vane, and paid the ultimate price for his discernment. The following morning, the newspapers erupted with sensational accounts of what they dubbed the two-headed calf affair. The Pall Mall Gazette's headline proclaimed, "Scientific fraud revealed in bizarre inheritance plot," while the Times took a more measured approach with, "Eminent biologist arrested in Sussex murder mystery." As we breakfasted amidst the clamour of newsboys shouting below our window, Holmes tossed aside the more lurid accounts with distaste. The press inevitably fixates on the grotesque rather than the true crime, he remarked, delicately dissecting a kipper with his fork. Vane's greatest sin was not creating a monstrosity, but betraying the very principles of scientific inquiry for personal gain. I thought of the quiet Sussex pastures now under Fairweather's care, and of the twisted path that had led us to the truth. At least the estate will be put to proper use now, I observed. Holmes nodded, his gaze drifting to where his violin case lay nearby. Indeed, though I suspect this case will have one lasting effect, Watson. Oh? He smiled faintly. I shall never look at a country livestock show quite the same way again. Outside, the ordinary sounds of London carried on, blissfully unaware of the darkness we had uncovered. But in that moment, I found myself peculiarly grateful for the comforting normalcy of our Baker Street rooms, where the only mysteries were those Holmes chose to pursue, and the only monsters were decidedly human. Epilogue, the squire's heir. The morning mist clung to the Sussex downs as our carriage rolled up the long drive of Blackwood Manor for the final time. Young Mr. Thaddeus Fairweather, the newly confirmed heir to the estate, stood waiting on the gravel sweep, his lean frame silhouetted against the ivy-clad stone of the ancestral home. A man of perhaps 25, with the sun-browned complexion of one who spends more time in the field than the drawing-room, he stepped forward to greet us with an earnestness that spoke well of his character. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, shaking our hands with a grip made strong by years of handling specimens and field equipment. "I cannot thank you enough for uncovering the truth of my cousin's death. The estate shall be put to proper use now, I assure you." Holmes, who had been quietly observing the young man's well-worn but meticulously maintained field boots and the faint stains of botanical dyes on his fingers, gave one of his rare, approving nods. "Your work with the Linnean Society, I believe?" The paper on Mendelian inheritance in domesticated fowl was particularly illuminating. Fairweather's eyes brightened with surprise and pleasure. You read my monograph, sir? Then you understand my intentions for Blackwood's breeding programs will be strictly scientific, with none of Vane's unnatural manipulations. Just so, Holmes replied, his sharp gaze sweeping over the orderly kennels and pastures visible beyond the manor. The law may have resolved the inheritance, but it is men like you who determine whether justice endures. As we took our leave, I noted with satisfaction the healthy livestock grazing in the distance, their forms pleasingly ordinary after the grotesque spectre of Vane's two-headed creation. Holmes remained uncharacteristically silent during our return journey, though I recognized the satisfied set of his features. It was the look he wore when a problem had been neatly resolved, with all loose ends properly tucked away. Back in our Baker Street quarters, as I repacked my medical bag, for one never knew when a revolver wound or a poisoning might require attention, Holmes stood at the window, his violin cradled absently against his chest. "You seem content with the outcome," I remarked, securing a fresh roll of bandages. He plucked a thoughtful pizzicato note before answering. "The world contains enough natural wonders without men fabricating monstrosities, Watson. Fairweather will do right by that land, and England's laws, while occasionally archaic, ultimately serve justice." And so we reached the conclusion of another extraordinary case, one that even Sherlock Holmes himself declared singularly grotesque in its particulars. If you enjoyed this peculiar tale of scientific ambition and medieval laws, do consider subscribing to the Drawing Room Detectives. We bring you fresh mysteries inspired by the greatest sleuths of literature, Holmes's razor-sharp deductions, Poirot's little grey cells, Miss Marple's quiet wisdom, and more. Thank you for joining us in the drawing room tonight. Remember, the world is full of extraordinary mysteries, but as Holmes would say, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Until next time, keep observing, for the smallest details often conceal the grandest revelations.